I think Blaž just said some of the things I wanted to say in the introduction, except that it's not my first time I'm presenting in front of artists, it's the second time. And this is actually due to Martin, and I have to thank him for inviting me again, because I was here again in October last year. And in October last year I said I had the same problem I have today. Having a background in philosophy is like really bad, because you want to say a lot of things in a lot of weird terms. So I have the same problem as in October, as trying to come down to something more easy. And so I think today I just started to make a sort of workshop. I proposed the title Parasite and on the nature of transitory art, in hope that we might be able at the end of this event to give a definition to what transitory art is. After all the talks we had, I realized we have absolutely no way of actually defining it, and there is actually no need to define it. So I started my...
If it's too much complicated for me, can you make it more easy for us?
Yes, that's the plan.
No.
Yes.
I might simulate it easier for people.
Another problem was exactly the fact that I will be a bit longer than Blaž. Another problem was the fact that most of you have presented lots of interesting and very visual and very contact-like projects. So coming from theory, it's a bit difficult to get there. So I will have two parts of my presentation. The first part is a bit more like theoretical, and I will just propose and advance some ideas. And then the second part, I will feature 5 projects that I have curated for my own art platform, and which I think they can be labeled as transitory in relation to the human body. So I will start this by a simple workshop that starts from the very title. So today I just sit in the room and thought, you know, I wanted to say that Parasite is a title that shows a sort of like different location than what we are accustomed to. And so I made this, you know, like the dictionary that Blaž mentioned very critically, and just started like telling you exactly how I reached some of my ideas. So I started from the Latin, which means paro, to prepare. Then I went to parare in French and Italian, which is to defend, to shield. And I saw this term to shroud. Now from to shroud, I also made from paro, like all the etymology, and tried to figure out what does this mean. But to shroud has 2 meanings that caught my attention. It's like a cloth used to wrap a body for burial. And I think that it is important that you remember this for the last part of my presentation. And then it's something that conceals, protects, or screens. And from here, I try to understand what does to conceal mean. And to conceal means to keep away from being seen, found, observed, and to hide. And this is how I reached the idea of camouflage, which I think is very closely related to what we understand as transitory, except it has to do more with a technique of the body adapting to its environment. It is something that we less discussed here, and it is something that I want to sort of like depart from the idea of technology and techniques and projection and all the means that we actually use, and go back to the idea that to the idea of the relation between the body and its environment. So this camouflage, you know, I also went down and just searched from term to term. And the one thing that caught my attention was that in biology it includes this cryptic and apathetic coloration. Then again, I went to what cryptic means and discovered that it has this double meaning of using a code and a cipher, having a hidden meaning being something secret, occult, and of course tending to conceal. Apathetic again in zoology, like relating to or characterizing coloration serving as natural camouflage, which is another interesting aspect because we all talked mainly about technology and less about the way we actually adapt our bodies to nature and to our environment. And so, because I reached this, I came across this book, this recent book, which was published by Zoom Books by Hannah Rose Schell. in which she actually has a sort of anthropology of what camouflage means, and tries to adapt it to media, photography, and tries to show us by using 3 examples what camouflage can be reduced to. Again, I underlined things that I thought were interesting, and I highlighted in red things that I think are interesting to our discussion about transitory art. So camouflage is a meaningful way of seeing, being, moving and working in the world, but it is also a form of self-awareness that is part of network of institutional practices. Then, it is an adaptive logic of escape. It can be labeled as being static, serial or dynamic. And another thing which I found interesting is that it all reflects distinctive types of photographic reconnaissance. Then again, for some of you, another idea might be interesting, that camouflage escapes representation by design. Because some of the projects that were featured here have a lot to do with actually designing the space and not with actually constructing a space, which is another difference that I think for the future is very fruitful in discussing. So I went back to the term reflect, because reflect is a way of trying to give something back and trying to give an image of something. It goes back to mirror, it goes back to the idea of echo, and it goes back to, mythology and various representations that you can all relate to. And so this was the first introduction. So I didn't concentrate on the static camouflage. I just started directly from the serial camouflage, because we are discussing transitoriness, which is supposed to be something in motion. And serial camouflage is something that emerged actually in a military context and is synonymous with modern warfare because it was first used in World War I. It emerged as a sort of practice of human collectives and non-human actors, which is another thing worth mentioning, of trying to avoid reconnaissance technologies. What happened then is that we passed to dynamic camouflage, which is a sort of strategic concealment effected in response to real-time surveillance, in which camera positioning and movement are unknown. The example the book gives is quite interesting, because the author talks about the sniper in relation to the land war, and talks about the spectator in a cinema. So the spectator in a cinema has absolutely no idea where he will get shot from. And I thought this was a very interesting idea in relation to everything with installation, interactivity, transitoriness, and the way we cannot always understand or perceive what is happening to us and what is actually affecting our bodies. Of course, then, another idea is expressed by Roger Caillois in The Logic of Camouflage, as he understands this logic of camouflage as a translation of seeing into the world. This seeing is activated precisely by people who want to render themselves invisible, and it's something that also has to do in psychoanalysis with what they call pathological evacuation of identity. Another idea I went there from is Virilio and his understanding of the relation between camouflage and technology. The basic thing Virilio says is that camouflage influences the relation between technologies of perception and militarization. In this account, instead, technology takes over, and it is something that we actually reproduce in most of the practices today of our mediation of the world. So people become increasingly passive as images are accepted as truth, at least in an operational sense. But, live bodies, natural objects and human actions are the locus of active processes of self-fashioning and the substrate of camouflage media practices. The focus here is on human subject to shape the form it takes on, as well as the technologies necessary for the form's production. While I will give credit to everyone who presented here that they mostly concentrated on the techniques, not necessarily technologies necessary to that form's production, my presentation will slowly go towards the human subject and the form it takes. In the end, there is this quote from Hannah Rochelle that says that what is the configuration of the self versus environment that enables one to efface the traces of one's own presence from photographic media or surveillance. It is camouflage consciousness in which full self-consciousness becomes literal photographic self-analysis. Now, I will move back to my title, which also mentioned the word sight. And sight is something that we usually label to locate something, and this is the one sense I underlined in my presentation, because we are usually trying to locate. This is to put between limits something that we want to understand, and in this case, you know, we are also talking, when I look at the title, of countries in transition, and it was a term that was brought up in the discussion and which I find to be truly false. Coming from a country in so-called transition, from Romania, I think the entire discussion about East and West and what we are trying to do by trying to emphasize this on the Balkans is a bit of a misleading strategy, and I will try to explain why. Because one of the first things that is characteristic of the East is that in the East, technology has never been completely mastered. This is the one huge difference when speaking about East and West. For example, and this is an example from art, Russian constructivism, and in architecture as well, stands out thanks to the utopian impossibility of its technological fantasies. The difference between East and West is that while in the East we were dreaming and fantasizing over technology, in the West we were actually trying to implement it. And so in the East, technology was either a utopian reverie or a pragmatical technical upgrade. This is why in the East the whole question of technology, I think, must be put in completely different terms. So I go back to Eastern modernity. And the one thing I would like to say about this is that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a few other theoreticians, especially in the field of architecture, in Romania at least, we cannot talk about modernity. We cannot talk about modernism. We talk about modernization, which means, you know, a quasi-colonial action. It is something that we always relate to the West, but it's never something that is something of our own. We always relate it to the West and what happened in the West, but it's not our history. This is why art theoretician Boris Groys says that this is one of our biggest problems, acknowledging that in the East communism was actually